It was what we'd been waiting for. The first snow of winter fell in great fluffy patches, and we all knew what it meant. When I was a kid, I remember waiting patiently for the first snows. Sometimes it hit North Georgia in December. Sometimes it came before Thanksgiving. A few times in my life, I even saw it come down before Halloween. But it always came eventually. It was a constant in this part of the world, as constant as the migrating birds or the pumpkin harvest, and the arrival of snow was almost as prophetic as the calendar. We had taken the unreasonably warm November as a good sign, but it appeared that now the snow was here. The snow never came anywhere close to the gardens, of course, but we could see it falling across the town. It didn't matter if it fell in the parking lot or not, of course. It was merely a sign of the conflict to come. The declaration we'd received before Halloween had been very clear, and we knew that if an attack was coming, it would be now. We'd been preparing for over a month, despite how little the lady thought of the challenge. The old goats were making preparations, despite the lady's feelings, and the park had become an armed camp. It's me again, your favorite security guard. Welcome to the war effort for Kashmir Botanical Gardens. Since early November, the Brandylow and the forces of summer have been making preparations for the coming battle with the Green Man. We've raised earthen barriers. Something we told the park goers was for a display on erosion, and Randy and Tobias have been drawing in more allies for the coming fight. Our allies in the field, the ever-destructive gnomes, have reported that the Green Man is gathering his own forces at an alarming rate. He had pumpkin heads, scarecrows, some kind of corn monstrosities, and a host of humans willing to follow him for power and wealth. The numbers varied, but sounded like he had about 100 or so of the pumpkin heads, and 3 times as many scarecrows. They didn't know how many of the corn things he had, but it sounded like we were outnumbered either way. We had Rasfiel, but what could one tree creature do against an army? He answered my question a couple of days later. I had struck up a friendship with him, the two of us bonding over stories of our lives. He had way more than me, having existed for a long, long time, but he enjoyed my tales of mundanity and the ideas of a normal life. One night when I went to see him, I saw him staring off into the distance, standing as still as, well, a tree. He was emitting a low vibration from his wooden body, a sound too high-pitched for me to hear, and when I came to stand beside him, he looked down and I heard the sound taper off. It was hard to tell. His face wasn't as expressive as the ones in the area where the lady displayed her grisly artwork, but I got the idea that he was happy to see me. What was all that about, big guy? Rasfiel always spoke inside my head, his mouth not made for speaking, and sometimes there were pictures too. The picture he sent me was of a grove of trees growing close together, and a clear message of family. Family? I asked. Are you calling for your... I paused, having almost said people, but he seemed to understand and nodded. Would they come? I asked. He sent me a little picture of a grove of trees bowing down to the lady. They served her once, he said in his creaky old voice. They might again. I nodded. I hope so. When I told Randy about it, he laughed out loud. Shoot, it'd be nice to get a few more of them walking trees. I mean, besides the ones we have. We need fighters. Trees with muscle, like Rasfiel, not birches and oaks with snaky roots. Translation, we need troops that are a little more mobile. I agreed, but I knew most of our defenses were dependent on the ladies taking part. I'd met her a few times for our evening walks, telling her about Halloween and Christmas especially, but she always changed the subject when the war came up. She seemed younger this time of year, more girl than crone, and she reminded me of the Snow Queen from the C.S. Lewis books. I would never have told her such. The White Witch was the bad guy, after all, but the parallels weren't lost on me. My lady, I said one night, we could really use your help with the preparations for the coming war. We had been talking about Christmas, Santa Claus to be specific, and her smile had melted away like snow on the hot top. Did Randolph ask you to talk to me? She said icily, and I shook my head. No, Randy and Tobias are making plans, But I'm worried. They don't think we have enough people to stand against them. The scouts say it's been a busy year for him, and I'm afraid we won't be able to defend this place if he comes." She laughed then, and her laughter was like the tinkling of icicles in a heavy wind. "Do not fret. I have means. I have friends. This would not be the first time I've put aside such an attack. The Green Man has hounded me since before I stepped out of our world and into yours. Like the seasons, sometimes he is up and sometimes he is down. We fight constantly, but it always ends in stalemate. I don't honestly know if we can defeat each other, but next year we will inevitably dance the dance again." She seemed utterly nonplussed about something that could easily lose her the seat of power that she had fought so hard to obtain. Perhaps she had forgotten what war was like while she was trapped inside that statue. Maybe, I thought, this Green Man had been the one to put her there. I wondered if she'd had a cord as large as this one when she'd gone into plaster, and the thought made me realize that she probably continued to grow her power from within the statue. How long had she been inside the park? How long had Dr. Thurston's father held her before his son had lost control? She said goodbye not long after that, but I was left with nothing but questions. I came back to find Randy and Tobias having a loud argument in the security hut. Neither of them looked up when I came in, and it seemed they had forgotten everything except their disagreement. I was a little shocked. I didn't think I had heard Tobias talk that much in the whole time that I'd known him, and I had never heard him raise his voice. "We cannot contact them without the lady's permission," Tobias said, the tone letting me know that it was something he'd said a few times. "But they could turn the tide of battle," Randy said, throwing his hands in the air. "Do you want to get killed by this green guy when he comes around?" "Green man," Tobias corrected him. "And no, obviously I don't want to get killed, but this will be seen as a betrayal if she doesn't approve. If she doesn't get serious about this, then there won't be another war for her to look down her nose at. We'll all be dead, and she'll be in his hands again. You don't want that, right?" Tobias bristled a little. "Of course not. You could be exiled for this, though. The courts are not to be contacted under any circumstances, especially not if the lady isn't going to be in attendance when the talk takes place." Randy opened his mouth to say something that would likely have led to more shouting, and I opened the door and closed it louder to draw the attention of the two Brandylow. "What are you two arguing about?" I asked, coming in to stand between them. Tobias pointed an accusing finger at Randy. "The captain here wants to contact the Fey courts of Winter without the express consent of the lady." There was silence for a moment as I processed that. "The what?" I finally asked, not sure I'd heard him right. "The bloody Fey courts, the beings that hold sway over the seasons. It's a solid plan. If we can get the Winter Fey on our side, then we can use them against the Green Man." Tobias put a hand to his face and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Not only would that be a huge slap in the face of Titania, the Queen of Summer, and the Fey, who has extended a place to the lady within her court, but Queen Mab is the patron of the Green Man. Why would she turn her back on a champion of winter to side with the lady of her clearly summery rival?" Randy sat back, scratching his furry chin as he thought. "Well, Mab would be Queen Mab," Tobias corrected. "Whatever. No, Manling, it isn't whatever. Queen Mab does not tolerate insolence, and neither will Titania. Queen Mab has been known to flay emissaries alive when they cross her. If you intend to get yourself killed by a fairy queen, then exile might be a better option for you." "Wait," I said, sitting down as I tried to put it together. "You mean the fairy courts? Like the one from Shakespeare? They're real?" Tobias turned and gave me a look as if he were surrounded by fools. "Do they not teach children anything in this school that they send them to? Even in my time, we knew the fairy courts were real. Who else would bring the seasons? Who else would change the fates of mortals?" Randy and I shrugged in unison, and Tobias sighed as he sat down heavily. "You want to strike a deal with the Winter Fae, and you don't even know they exist. This is already off to a great start." "So enlighten me. I think it's a good idea, and I'll call on them for help, with or without your help." Randy shook his head. "Very well. The Fey Courts are old, and as in older than man. They are forces of nature, and they don't help people out of the goodness of their hearts. You would need to make a deal with them. A deal you aren't prepared to make. A deal you can't make." "Why not?" Randy asked. "Because the deal is almost always for your soul, and you don't currently have one to trade. The lady holds your soul, our souls, and she's not going to give it back to you just so you can strike a one-sided deal with Winter." Randy blew out a breath, sounding like a horse before hitting the table. "Well, damn, how else are we going to get them to fight with us? We need allies, Tobias. We got 70 Brandylow and a few hundred gnomes, and a Grove Guardian. They're going to walk right over the top of us." "We have the trees," Randy reminded him, "and the lady. Have a little faith, Randy." "I'm trying, but that was when the rumbles began. Luckily, they had chosen nighttime to come to us, because if they'd come during the day, it would have likely caused a panic." The ground thrummed, shaking things off the desk and sending some of the monitors into fits of snow. It was like being in an earthquake, and Randy cursed as he asked what was happening. To my surprise, Tobias was smiling as he felt the vibrations and clearly recognized them. "Sounds like you might have your allies," he said a little smugly. We were out the door in a few seconds, but we were nowhere near as quick as Racefell. The tree man was striding across the park, adding his rumbling steps to the shaking, and we followed closely behind him. He was heading for the front gate, and as I came up behind him, I could already see something coming towards the other side. It was like a small forest coming through the parking lot, and I remembered thinking that they made Racefell look like a child by comparison. As the gates came open, he rumbled in excitement as it approached the growing trees. These were the trees from the vision he had sent me. These were the trees that had bowed to the lady. They were all twice the size of Racefell, and by my count there were 12 of them at least. It looked like the grove was about to get crowded, and I hoped our little wooden guardian would explain the rules to his new family. Whatever might happen, the sight of the trees embracing their smaller fellow was very cute and more than a little heartwarming. "Think we might be able to hold them off with 13 more Grove Guardians?" I asked, nudging Randy as he began to grin. "You know, I think we just might," he answered. It all started with the little girl and her horse. The park had closed until the new year, Randy fearing that if the Green Man and his army showed up, people might get hurt. The lady thought it was a bit drastic, but Randy told her that it would give her more time to make the new exhibits, too. "You can unveil a whole new crop of new exhibits when we reopen in January." The lady had liked that, and now she toiled by the lily pond with the few Brandylow that we had spared her. The 4 Brandylow that Randy had sent her, Tobias among them, were under strict orders to keep her there and protect her with their lives. If she wouldn't fight, Randy said, then we would protect her the best way we knew how. He had deputized every other Brandylow, giving them clubs and telling them that their usual duties were suspended until after the situation was handled. That's how I came to be walking my night route when I suddenly heard the last sound I expected to hear. I heard the clip-clop-clip of horses' hooves. I was supposed to be on patrol with 5 other Brandylow, but I hadn't seen a one of them. Charles and Razzie had likely stopped patrolling after it stopped being fun, and Margot, Logan, and Hamish had been drunk when they arrived and had gotten less sober as the shift went on. I was the only one still walking around on the regular, and when I heard the hooves, my light began to turn fitfully. I wasn't sure what to expect, honestly. I had recently learned that gnomes, fairies, goat people, pumpkinheads, and corn abominations were real, and I wasn't sure what I expected to come walking up the path. A centaur, a pegasus. I guess anything was possible after all that. I was near the 4th ring when I found the source of the noise, and I nearly dropped my flashlight when I saw them. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, her long white hair hanging down over the green mantle she wore over her shoulders. She was dressed in a perfect little suit of brown armor, and I thought it might be ringmail over leather, if I remember much from my D&D days. She wore a bow across her back and a little quiver of arrows. The horse she rode looked about 3 sizes too big for her, its perfect white skin and mane looking unnatural somehow. She was holding a map, the lines on it glowing slightly, and she was talking to the horse as she stroked its neck. "Come on, Artemis, the lady needs us. We have to find her." When the horse, Artemis I supposed, turned back towards me, I was in for a bigger surprise than the pint-sized warrior. The horse wasn't a horse at all. It was a unicorn. Artemis noticed me as she turned and lowered her head as she snorted in warning. The horn on the front of its head looked absolutely enormous, and I couldn't help but notice in the dim light of the steel lamps that there was a rusty tint to the last 3 inches of the ivory spike. I could probably dodge out of the way if it ran at me, but I doubted I could outrun it if it took a notion to chase me. The little girl looked up from the creature's back as it scraped its hoof against the concrete, and her eyes brightened as she noticed me. "Oh, thank goodness. Artemis, be good. This is one of the lady's servants. He can take us to her. Please, sir, can you show us where the pale lady is? I want to speak with her." I considered taking her to Randy instead, but the little girl had a way of speaking that reminded me of the lady, and that made me hesitant to disobey her. In the end, I took her in her strange conveyance to the lily pond, where the lady was working her magic. She was growing fruit trees, the fruit looking like an odd hybrid of existing fruits, and when the girl saw her, she squealed and dropped off her steed. "My lady," she said, hugging around the middle as she waded heedlessly into the pond. The pale lady looked down in surprise, but I was more surprised to see her smile as she stroked the girl's fine white hair. It was a very human action from Our Lady, and it always warmed my heart to see something almost human in her. As she stroked her hair, I was in for another surprise as the tips of her pointed ears poked through that satin sheet. Was the girl an elf? Once you learn that fairies and unicorns are real, I supposed anything was possible. "Gabriella, what are you doing here?" The little girl seemed to remember something important and stepped back as she threw a fist into her chest in salute. "My lady, I bring news from the Court of Moons. The Green Man is planning to move against you. He's marshaling his forces to—" "Your mother must be worried sick," the pale lady said, the water soaking into her dress as she took a knee beside the little warrior. "We have to get you home before she worries too much." The girl stammered a little as the lady tried to lead her out of the pool, pulling away with a splash as she nearly fell into the water. "I came all this way to warn you," she shrilled, stomping her foot and sending up a little wave. "He's going to attack you before year's end. Where are your armies? Where are your allies? Why didn't you ask Mother for help?" Our mistress was at a loss in the face of the little girl's indignation, and she seemed unsure of herself in a way that I had never seen. "Gabriella, this is a dance of summer and winter. We all win and lose in our time. If it's my time to be defeated, then so be it. As for your mother, I wouldn't have her waste her warriors on my behalf. The immortals are hardly to be asked to give up their precious gifts for the squabble of seasons." I started to voice something in the wake of her words, but it seemed that Gabrielle had formed a similar idea. "Then why is it okay for your poor Brandylow to forfeit their lives for such a squabble? Are they any less important than my mother's forces? I assumed he had snuck up on you, but you intend to just let him win." The lady floundered in the face of this fiery little envoy, and when she looked at me for some kind of support, all I could do was shrug. The kid had a point. However she meant to answer the child, it was rendered moot. Carl came clopping up about that time, calling for the lady and telling her how she was needed at the front gate. When she asked why, he just shook his head in disbelief. "There's about a dozen extras from a Lord of the Rings movie up there, and they look pissed." We were all moving in a matter of seconds, the lady in the lead as she glided for the front entrance. Carl had been correct, I saw. Randy and about 5 of his newly deputized security personnel were standing their ground against a dozen armed and armored warriors, pointed ears sticking out of their helmets. They had short bows bent and nocked, all except for the woman in the lead, her face inches away from Randy's as she stood her ground. She was fierce, her straight white hair cut short to reveal ears that jutted back past her shoulders. Her armor was silver, a contrast to the bronze-colored plates her fellows wore, and she had a long sword drawn back in preparation to run Randy through. Despite its proximity to my friend, the longsword caught my eye. It was beautiful, silver and spun steel, and looked like something from a fantasy movie. It caught the light as it caught my eye, and I couldn't help but be in awe of this powerful lady at the gate. "I don't give a damn about your assurances. I am the Lady Mallory Moonborn, Queen of the Court of Moons, and you will let me through to see your lady and find my daughter." Randy had his shotgun pressed against her breastplate, but he seemed to be having some real doubts that it would do him any good. He clearly thought these armored whatevers were from the Green Man, and they intended mischief. He didn't want any trouble in the park, and the brandy load that he had with him looked ready to handle business. But they would have a time of it against this lot. "Ma'am, I can assure you that there is no one in here but us. Park's been closed for the better part of 2 weeks, and for good reason. Unless you want some problems, I would suggest you pick up your LARP group and head home. Unless you want trouble." Gabriella looked shocked as she rode up, calling out to her mother as we came to the scene. Her mother looked up, the Queen of the Moon Court, looking relieved to see her child. The unicorn bowed to the Queen as the little girl slid off, and Randy backed up as she went to wrap her arms around her relieved mother. The warrior queen dropped her sword and bent to pick up the little girl, holding her close as she silently scolded her for running off. The sight of her blade laying on something as mundane as our parking lot was strange, like a rare flower growing up through the concrete. Kinda made me wish I had a camera. As the pale lady approached, the Queen's eyes narrowed, though I didn't think she was as angry as she was putting on. "I gave you sanctuary, brought you into our family, and this is how you repay us? I told you then, and I'll remind you now, your war with the Green Man is your own, and I will not—" "She didn't call me, Mother. I came to warn her about the Green Man." The Queen looked at her daughter, not quite believing what she was hearing, and her gaze turned apologetic. "Gabriella, what have you done?" "She's our friend, Mother. We have to warn her." Gabriella was crying, but the Queen looked like a rat that's just discovered it's trapped in a cage. "Nasri, how many do we have with us?" she called, one of the pale-haired warriors approaching to throw a salute. 12, ma'am. Another 30 searching the town and surrounding area." Their bows had been lowered, the mood shifting into something less dire for everyone, except the Queen. She still looked like she expected to be attacked at any moment. The snow falling lamely beyond the borders of the park, and that's when I noticed something else. The snow wasn't the only thing creeping in. There was a fog, something that should have been impossible with the snow on the ground. It was thick and sinister, snaking its way into the park as it surrounded us. "Call them to us," she whispered. "Get them inside the gate." Nasri took a banded horn from his belt and blew a long blast into the crisp air. Immediately 4 others joined us, and their numbers grew by leaps and bounds as the Queen turned to the pale lady. She set her daughter back on Artemis's back, locking eyes with her, and the effect was galvanizing. The indifference that I'd seen before melted away, and it seemed that Our Lady now understood the weight of what was upon her. She clearly valued the lives of these elves. I still wasn't sure what they were, but they were important to her. Even more important than we were, it seemed. How many do you count in your ranks? 70 Brandylow, 13 tree sentinels, about 300 gnomes, and 30 or 40 moving trees. Whatever the Queen had been hoping to hear, it wasn't that. It will have to do. Gather your forces, she said, turning to Randy. If you have fire, get it ready. If you have more of those, she said, indicating his gun, I suggest you arm your soldiers. The attack is nigh, and we're already under siege. As the fog crept in and the shadows beyond it became more substantial, I realized the war we were promised was upon us. As the heavy gates closed, I wondered if we would see the sunrise the next day, or be swept beneath the encroaching night. Dr. Pamela Winters sat up in bed, Marguerite making uncomfortable noises as she tried to ignore her partner's sudden state. Vampires didn't really sleep, not like normal folks. Hell, Winter didn't really sleep either. The two entered an alternative state of mind where they put their minds in an open state, but something had interrupted that for Pamela tonight. She looked around, looking for the source of her agitation, but she couldn't find anything that would have brought her up. Nonetheless, Winter had heard something. No, heard wasn't right. She hadn't heard anything, not with her ears. It was the same way that she had known what the Barker was. It was the same way that she had known what the ghost was when she had been in Stragview. It was a feeling on her skin, a feeling humans generally called a prickling of the hairs on their neck, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "What is it, my love? What troubles you?" Maggie asked, sitting up groggily. Pamela wasn't sure, but Winter had some ideas. It was like the shadows in the death house, except this one was cold. "Get dressed. We might need to go out." "Now? You do not usually go out after dark." "I think the town might be in trouble," Dr. Winter said. In that, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't the only one roused to action either. "Fog's really coming in," Officer McGrath commented as he and Officer Stebbins lit up outside the captain's office. "Fog?" Stebbins said, looking up to confirm that yes, there was fog coming in. "It's impossible. It's snowing." It had been a pretty light day, the snow keeping the inmates of Stragview inside, and the night had been even less active. The count had gone smoothly for once, and the one code they'd had that night was someone trying to hang themselves. This wasn't uncommon, as the holidays came and went, and they'd gotten him sorted and taken him to a show cell. They had all been enjoying a nice, peaceful night. Everyone knew better than to use the Q word until 6 a.m. came around. But the fog and snow could cause some real visibility problems out here. "Better tell the captain," Stebbins said, puffing on his cigarette as he rubbed his hands together. "He'll need to tell the post vehicles to go stationary." McGrath gave him a side-eye as the lighter stopped halfway to the exotic-smelling tip of the little cigar that he was planning to light up. "Why have I got to tell him?" "'Cause, stupid, your tinder ain't burning yet." McGrath was about to ask his friend who he thought he was calling stupid when a shadow came blundering up through the fog and the blowing snow. McGrath thought it was weird since most everyone else was snug in their dorms right now. Technically, he and Stebbins were supposed to be doing checks, a perimeter and a stun fence check, but they had stopped by the office to see if the snow would back off any before they headed out. The figure coming up was walking strangely, staggering like a drunk, and he wondered if some inmate had managed to make it out of the dorm. Stebbins seemed to have noticed him too, and he called out a challenge as whoever it was got closer to them. He expected the person to call back or break into a run once noticed, but they just kept coming. They were about 20 feet away, when McGrath saw the last thing that he expected to see come stumbling out of the fog. It was a damn scarecrow. "What the hell?" he blustered, thinking someone was playing a trick on him. "Who the hell goes there dressed like that?" The figure said nothing, just continuing to come as if nothing had been said. "You know, you're a little late for Halloween," McGrath said, his hands going to the can of OC spray as the thing still didn't say a word. He was expecting a prank, maybe some inmate drunk on Christmas spirits up to mischief. But this was a little spooky. Whatever it was, it just kept coming, and amidst the snow and fog, McGrath was pretty sure that he could see others too. As it came shambling closer to him, he thought he saw 3 or 4 or maybe as many as 6 coming for the lighted windows of the captain's office, and his neck hair was definitely up. He let fly with a stream of chemical agents, but amidst the wind and the falling powder, he couldn't be sure that any of it had hit the thing. McGrath was backing up, trying to distance himself from the advancing creature, when Stebbins came in with a right cross and sent it sprawling in the snow. "Son of a bitch," Stebbins breathed, his breath coming out in a puff. "You all right?" McGrath nodded, but he almost screamed as the scarecrow got up from the snow and began making its way towards them again. Both officers were backing up, trying to get to the door, when the thing suddenly burst into flames and went rolling in the snow. As they watched, the other shambling forms fell over, their bodies erupting in flame as the compound was lit by a sudden bonfire. Something else was coming out of the swirl, a new form that moved with purpose, and they straightened up as the visage of the warden came walking out of the fog. "Good evening, gentlemen. I wonder, could you tell me which captain is on tonight?" McGrath was left dumbfounded, the man in the pinstripe suit looking very out of place in the wintry landscape, but Stebbins managed to pick up the slack. "Kelly, sir. Captain Kelly's on tonight." "Oh, well," the warden said, looking unbothered by the floundering ragman not too far from their conversation. "I guess he'll have to do. Come with me," he told them, and the pair found themselves following before they could think better of it. When the warden said jump, you didn't bother to ask why. "Wake up, kid. We got business tonight, it would seem." I sat up out of a dead sleep, looking around and finding Grandpa standing over me. He was dressed in a long coat, his usual backwoods leather one, and had a floppy leather hat to match. He was leaning on one of those knobbly sticks he made for the tourists, but this one looked less for hiking and more for doing battle with the Dark Lord's minions. He sighed impatiently at me as I rubbed my eyes, trying to orient myself as I made sense of it all. "Gramps, what time is it?" "Time for you to get up, Grasshopper. Get your materials together. Something strange is afoot." I nodded, knowing better than to argue with Grandpa. He rarely came all the way up the stairs these days, and when he did, it was pretty important. As he stumped off downstairs, I got my accoutrements ready. I grabbed my sigils from the dresser, put on a coat similar to his that he had gotten me as an early Christmas present, and stared at the box on the top left shelf for a long moment before reaching in to feel the reassuring solidity of a different gift. It felt like cheating. Grandpa wouldn't like it, but I slid it into my pocket anyway before making my way downstairs. Grandpa was putting on his boots as I grabbed mine out of the shoebox, and I saw that he had brought my own walking stick from the entryway. It was made of dark wood too, though mine was stained. Whatever tree Grandpa had made his out of was that color, and it made for an intimidating piece of lumber. "Where are we going?" I asked, Grandpa putting on his satchel and heading for the door. "Into town, boy. Like I said, something's going on, and they need help." I looked at the clock on the fireplace. At 11:24 at night? "No, they needed help about 30 minutes ago, but you were getting ready," Grandpa said, laughing as I rolled my eyes and accepted the jab. "Any idea what it is?" I said, locking the door as Grandpa waited for me to unlock the ancient old war machine that was his truck. "No clue, but it's something bad enough to get me out of a dead sleep at this time of night." The engine roared as I brought it to life, putting it in gear and looking back as I pulled down the driveway in reverse. Well then, let's hope it's something we can figure out pretty quick. I had things to do tomorrow. Weather's looking funny out there, Mark said from the door. I looked up from my latest entry, proofreading the story about the ghost who jumped at 318, and saw that the lobby doors were covered in a thick fog. Huh, that's weird, I said, getting up to stand with Mark by the doors. You don't usually see fog and snow at the same time. I don't think I've ever seen it happen, Mark said, almost dreamily as he reached for the lock on the door. He clearly wanted to go have a closer look, but as I watched the door, I saw something by the fountain that made me reach out to stop him. It was just a person, well, a person shape, and it was lumbering up for the door. But there was something about the way it moved that made me not want to let it too close. It walked like it might be drunk, but I had seen drunk people walk before. In reality, it seemed like whoever was walking was just pretending to be drunk. Mark shook me off, looking down at my hands with mild confusion and indignation. What'd you do that for? I don't know. I just don't think you should go out there. I saw something, and we both jumped when someone ran into the door, and I looked up to see the grinning face of a scarecrow. It was a little weird to see one so out of season, but we wouldn't have long to wonder why it was here. We jumped again when another scarecrow hit the glass, farther down, followed by a third, and a fourth. I stepped to the desk, grabbing my radio as Mark watched them pile up against the guest entrance doors. Fortunately, the glass had been reinforced after an angry guest had tried to run his car into them after closing hours one day, and I figured that it would take a lot more than some flimsy straw man to get through that. Carl, you there? I said, keying up the radio. There was silence for a minute, and then came Carl's out-of-breath response. What's going on? We got something at the guest entrance door. A lot of somethings. He keyed over me, and I heard him curse at something before asking, Is it scarecrows? I nodded, but realized he wouldn't be able to see that. Yeah, like a ton of them. They're trying to come into the ER, too. I've sealed most of them in the vestibule area, between the inner and outer doors, but some of them got in already. I furrowed my brow. Wait, aren't they just people in costumes? Can't the police, like arrest them or something? Can't seem to get the police. Something's cut the phone lines of the non-emergency services. They're not working. What's more is that they aren't people. They're full of straw, but they move on their own. I heard him fighting with some of them in the background before he came back. Keep an eye on the door and let me know if they manage to crack the glass. I looked at the doors again and found that they were already 24 plastered against the glass, hanging to the window like bugs on a windshield. Is that likely? The glass is supposed to resist the initial collision of a small car. Yeah, well, so are the ER doors, but they've managed to bust it up already. They aren't through it, but they're making headway. I told him we'd keep him updated as the line went dead. Hell do we do? Mark asked. Sounds like we're on lockdown, I said, realizing that I needed to make the announcement. I picked up the overhead page phone and waited for 3 beeps before proceeding. All hospital staff and guests be advised we are in a state of lockdown. No one is to go in or out of the doors or open them for anyone outside. All staff and guests will be advised when the lockdown is lifted. I repeat, we are in a state of lockdown. No one is to go in or out of the doors or open them for anyone outside. All staff and guests will be advised when the lockdown is lifted. I hung it up with a click and sighed as I wondered what to do next. You better go back to the switchboard, I told Mark. Sounds like we might be about to get busy. Mark nodded, heading back as I watched the front glass pile up with cloth bodies. It was going to be a hell of a night here at Kashmir Hospital. You're asking me to basically abandon the perimeter, Captain Kelly said, steepling his fingers as the warden glowered down at him. I am, the warden said, clearly not liking the captain's tone. And if you don't do it pretty damn quick, we'll have 4 fewer officers to defend the compound. Because they'll be stuck outside the gate, Kelly asked, not seeming to like the implications. Because they'll be dead, the warden said, his words coming out clipped through gritted teeth. Right. Well, Warden, as you know, we have to have the perimeter manned. It's a violation of... The warden tuned him out, feeling the blood pumping in his ears as the man made excuses for his inaction. This is why the warden hated dealing with mortals with a spine. If Kipner had been on shift tonight, he would have sacrificed inmates in the yard if the warden had asked him to. Kipner was a spineless bootlicker, and the warden could get behind that sort of ladder climbing. Kelly, however, had morals and followed standards, and the warden couldn't fathom why he had promoted him to start with. So you see, it would be a violation of our... Captain, do you want the deaths of 4 officers on your head? That shut him up. I'm sorry. You're forgiven. Now get on your radio and tell them to park their vehicles by the front gate and get inside the compound before I find someone who will and put your uniform on them. Kelly looked affronted. You can't speak to me like that, warden or not. I've got half a mind to, but the warden had already determined that he had half a mind and no longer cared about this blather. He snatched up his radio off the desk and called all the post vehicles back to the control room gate. Emergency code turquoise, he said, giving the signal for hostile individuals near the compound. You sure, sir? Said one of the post drivers. 'Cause there's about a dozen individuals out here just... Yes, absolutely sure. Get back here now and bring your post weapons with you. Weapons on the compound? Kelly shouted. You can't... But the warden was already moving, closing the man into his office and holding the knob as he tried to get out. With a hard turn, he broke the handle, trapping Kelly in there for the near future. McGrath and Stebbins looked on in shock, but the warden was all smiles again. I want every post with 2 officers to send the second officer to the control room. They are to arm and prepare to defend the compound. You 2 go to the dorms and collect anyone with an active weapons card. Leave the TAs and the uncarded officers to watch the inmates. Tell them not to open the doors until an all clear is given. Do you understand? Both said they did, but McGrath was still a little confused. Is there a riot, sir? The warden mulled that over, finally saying, Of sorts, more like a siege. Get moving, you 2, and avoid anyone you see in the fog. They will hurt you. The 2 left, and the warden stepped out onto the yard as he sized up the nearest scarecrow. There were more of them now, a dozen or more standing in the fog, and he snapped his fingers as 4 of them fell in flames. He had been roused out of what quantified as a sound sleep for him by the emergence of something not of this world, and he had feared that the laughing shadows had escaped from their confinement for a fearful moment. When he had smelled the cold and the damp, however, he had known who was trying to invade his territory. The cold night could hunt for the summer bitch across the length and breadth of the county, or the world even, for all he cared. But when he brought their scuffles into Stragview, an example needed to be made. He roasted a few more of the scarecrows, smiling as he imagined what his fierce older sister must be doing with the straw men in her town. If he was angry, then he imagined she must be livid. The scarecrows went up in flames as winter scattered them like chaff. She had smelled the cold night from the second she came out of her home, and she was furious at this trespass. Why was he here? To take her town like he had so many others? She had read about Fraser, about the farms they had found abandoned, about the nonsense his followers had stirred up, and she was not impressed. Let him take his war to other towns. Kashmir belonged to her. That gave her a thought, something that had been tickling at the back of her neck for months now. She had felt it near the end of summer, an emergence of energy like nothing she had ever felt before seeing the shadow creatures. And now, it was something almost background, like the hum of a live wire. There was a new force at work in Kashmir, something she didn't understand, but wanted to. Come on, she said to Marguerite, turning to find her tearing into the strawmen with abandon. Her flesh mask had slipped a little, the creature beneath beginning to surface, but as Pamela called to her, she got herself back under control. Winter couldn't fault her. It had been a while since she'd been able to cut loose. but she didn't want any of the townspeople to see her like this. She could remove their memories, but Maggie would know that they had seen her, and seeing that pain in her lover's eyes would hurt her too. "Where to?" Maggie said, her voice husky and amorous as she righted herself. "Remember how you asked me last month if we could go to the botanical gardens, and I told you spring would be a better time?" Winter asked, fixing her own glamour before she could give herself away. Maggie nodded, her lips returning to normal as her teeth softened and became smaller. "How would you like a trip to the gardens tonight? I have a feeling that what we're looking for may be there." "Take exit 3, kid, and step on it. I've a feeling that something bad might be going down in town." The tires of the old truck squealed as I cut through the snow and took the exit he'd indicated. 3? It's the exit of the botanical gardens. Hey up, whatever's going on, I have a feeling it's got something to do with that place. The parking lot came into view as we drove, the heavy old truck skidding only a little as the snow crunched beneath our tires. It was empty of cars, no surprise since they had been closed since December 1st, but as we pulled in, the lights suddenly came on, and I saw that I had been mistaken. I could see figures gathering in the fog, and I gasped as I realized how many there were. Angry movement drew my eye, and I noticed them hemming in a small group of people. They had swords or something in their hands, but I remember thinking they were terribly outnumbered. Both groups looked up as the headlights illuminated them, and I slammed my foot down on the brakes. I felt a cold twist in my guts, knowing I wouldn't be able to stop. The armed group ran, but the rest crunched as we barreled into them. The others scattered as we pulled into the parking lot, and we slid sideways in the snow as I cut the wheel, nearly flipping as we came to a stop. I was breathing heavily, afraid that I had done something unforgivable, but Grandpa put a hand on my arm, and I looked down to see him shaking his head. "They're constructs, kid. Nothing but straw. They aren't real people. You'll be okay." As they turned to look at the truck, the headlights casting them in vicious shadows, one of them looked a little more substantial than the others. He had a pumpkin on his head, something I could see might be a little more than a carved gourd, and as we sat glaring at each other, I jumped when the door opened harshly, and Grandpa hopped out. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to tell him to get back in, but when he brought the end of his staff down on the concrete, I knew this was why he had come. "That one might be a little more real than the rest. Look sharp, kid. We're in the thick of it now." There was suddenly a harsh arc of fire as a line came cascading from the park. The flames hit the assembled crowd, and I could see that Grandpa was right. As their clothes took flame, I saw their sackcloth faces and oil-black eyes. They fell to pieces as the fire touched them, but that didn't stop the others from coming to menace Grandpa and I. The Pumpkinhead's mouth stretched into an abnormal grin, the firelight turning him into a far too realistic bit of Halloween decoration. "Well, well, well. You picked the wrong party to crash, Chuck." I looked over the edge of the wall, watching the scarecrows as they assembled outside the gardens. The intel hadn't done them justice. I could see a veritable horde of them. They filled our parking lot like a George Romero movie, and I realized that we didn't have a chance. They would pile up on the wall and bury us, and we would never see the real threat the army held. "Get ready," Randy growled, working the slide on his shotgun as he lifted the barrel. His club, the sign of his station, was strapped across his back, and the Brandylo who gathered around us clutched their clubs and tools uncertainly. Some of them had guns too. I was clutching my own shotgun tightly and just waiting for the push, and there was a collection of revolvers, shotguns, and even a few ARs they had found in Thurston's office. We had stuck the automatics with the most reliable shots among the security detail, and the majority of them had clubs and cudgels. The Queen and her court had called for fuel and fire, and as they lit their arrows, I saw a commotion begin in the parking lot. "Something's out there," I said, nudging Randy. He gave me a really look when I pointed out the group coming through the scarecrows beginning to gather up on the south side of the park. That's when he noticed what I had seen. "I think," he said, squinting. "Rolf, turn the parking lot lights on." The lights came up, and the sudden flash made me squint. I could see about a dozen or so armored elves standing off against the scarecrows. They were holding their own for the moment, but the mass of bodies converged on them, and I wasn't sure how long they could last. "We gotta help them," I hissed at Randy, looking around to find some way to get to them so they could come inside. "And we shall," the Queen said, coming up behind me as she raised a hand over her assembled archers. As they lifted their bows to fire, the tips dripping flame as the fuel burned, I saw something else coming to their rescue. An ancient truck came barreling through the crowd, scattering scarecrows as it skidded in the snow. The elves got out of the way, moving so they didn't get squished, and as it came to a stop, I saw a shrunken old man climb nimbly out of the cabin of the truck and move to stand before the horde. When the fire flashed overhead, the rain of flames coming down on the sackcloth bodies, they took the flames like a moth in a lantern. They fell against each other, setting themselves ablaze as someone else climbed out of the truck and went to help the old guy as he prepared to do battle with the scarecrows. That was when I saw him. His orange head was the most noticeable thing about that sea of cast-off scarecrows, and as he ran towards the pair, Randy had to hold me back as I tried to get over the wall after him. I didn't know if there was more of them, but I knew I wanted to shut that stupid pumpkin head up forever. I wanted to feel my stick bite into that brittle gourd and watch it fall apart. I wanted to make him pay for the things he had said about my mistress. Above all else, I wanted to silence the shaking fear that still resided in me at the memory of his taunts in the maze. "Are you crazy? You can't take all them scarecrows by yourself. If they're out there, then they're on their own. We got bigger problems." Another volley went overhead, bathing all of us in light, and that's when they came running for the wall. The sound of stick legs on concrete will likely haunt me for the rest of my life. "We gotta link up with them," Grandpa said, pointing at the armored figures as they held out against the charging scarecrows. Their armor was too thick for the constructs to do much more than scrape against them, but as I came around the group, Grandpa in tow, a group of scarecrows knocked one of them over, pummeling him with their knobbly arms. His fellows had him up pretty quick, but the bruises on his face were a livid purple, even from here. "Not a chance, old man," came a deep voice, and Grandpa threw up his hands as something silver came whistling out of the semi-dark. A wall of air caught the silver bat before it could smash Grandpa's skull in, and the pumpkin leered from behind the translucent barrier as Grandpa pushed him back with his will. He was wearing a ratty black hoodie, the bat he carried full of dings and digs. Whoever was under that mask couldn't have been more than a kid in high school, but when he swung the bat again, I saw his arm flex strangely as he brought it down. When the current of air broke apart, I swept Grandpa aside and imposed my stick in the way of the swing. The vibration thrummed up my arm, but the bat stopped. A live one," the pumpkinhead growled, and as I watched, thick green roots slid up from the sleeves of his hoodie and over the handle of his bat. "I could use a challenge before I go splatter a few of my master's enemies." He swung again, but I was already moving. I'd pushed Grandpa closer to the group of warriors, hoping they were on our side, and put myself between him and the pumpkinhead. The legs of his jeans pulsed with the same weird bulges as his arms, and I wondered if there would be an actual arm or leg under there, or if he would turn out to be some sort of weird plant thing. Something with stalks where his limbs should be. Maybe I thought he was nothing but living stalks and roots beneath all those ratty clothes. As he advanced, I pulled out one of my talismans from my pocket, and to my astonishment, the sigil began to grow. They had shown before, but this was the first time it had worked on the first try. The pumpkinhead stopped in his tracks, cocking his head at the sight of the glowing runes, and I thought for a moment that this might be what Grandpa felt as he put aside evil spirits. I was finally doing it. I was finally finding some control of my power, and as I watched the Pumpkinhead take a step back, I grinned as my magic finally became something I felt I could rely on. When he laughed, I felt some of my confidence waver. The hospital lockdown had advanced to encompass the whole first floor. We had started moving people upstairs pretty quickly after the doors to the ER had started breaking. Fortunately, the night had been light, and there were only about a dozen or so patients in the emergency room. It was the middle of the night, so most of the departments on the ground floor were empty, and after securing their areas as best they could, the staff had turned out to help us. We had tried to call for evacuation, but something was off with the emergency lines. The police, the fire department, it all just rang and rang. EMS, the ones inside the hospital when the lockdown started, were on the 5th floor with us already, and as we all huddled there and watched the security cameras, we wondered if help would ever come. We had been lucky so far, but I didn't know how long it could last. "Anything?" Carl asked me for about the 1,000th time. I shook my head. "Well, they haven't figured out how to run the elevators yet, so that's a plus. They're mostly just moving around aimlessly. I'm not sure they have much of a mind about them, and I sure don't know what they're looking for." Carl had declared himself the leader in this situation of martial law, and he'd made David turn off the elevators and told the other 3 floors that the 1st floor was unsafe for the time being. That went over about as well as you could hope, but the security guys he'd placed in the stairwell reported nothing more than some banging at the door. If they were after something, it seemed it was on the 1st floor, and they didn't have a lot of interest in the areas above that. Carl snorted. They sure knew what they were doing when they took the ER doors. I wasn't so sure, but as I watched them move around on the security camera, I couldn't help but think they looked a little coordinated. They reminded me of people who are looking for something that they don't really know about, something they aren't sure is actually there. They were paying special attention to areas I had reports of activity in, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were trying to find some of the spooks who lived in the hospital. I mentioned this to Carl, but he just laughed ruefully. "Let's hope not. Don't forget, the really spooky shit is up here with us." "Or in the stairwell," David put in morosely. I turned back to the monitors as the straw men started poking around the entrance to the boiler room. We could only hope they weren't trying to make friends inside the hospital. We had enough to deal with right now. The bullet slammed into the Scarecrow and dropped him off the fence as he attempted to climb into Stragview. He fell onto the snow in a heap, his straw head a ruin of sack and chaff, but there was always another one to take his place. Officer Carraway, one of Stragview's best riflemen, sighted up the new climber and put it down without wasting a shot. The warden was glad that she had made it out of the post vehicle in time, and as she fed a fresh magazine into the weapon, he hoped there would be enough rounds. Stragview had so few rifles, and most of the officers he had tasked with defending the perimeter had been given shotguns. They had even fewer hands to hold said rifles, and when the warden had looked out at the 15 members of D-Card who had come to the armory, he hoped it would be enough. It would have been 16, he reflected, if Kelly had done as he was told. The perimeter vehicles had been ambushed as they came back. Most of the drivers had managed to get safely to the control room, each vehicle having 12 rounds to go with a weapon, but Officer Gaffrey hadn't returned from the back 40 of the compound where he had been patrolling. They could see his vehicle sitting by the shed, the door open and the lights still on, but of old Gaffrey there was no sign. Still, 3 out of 4 wasn't bad, he supposed. You all know what the protocol is when the compound is attacked from the outside. Everyone had given the expected response. Once they were on the fence, deadly force could be utilized, even against civilians. Everyone is to arm themselves and protect the fence line. We have protesters on the grounds, and they have been warned that deadly force will be utilized. They've already attacked the post vehicles that are stationed to prevent such an incursion, and these 3 were lucky to make it through the checkpoint alive. The 3 officers had helped add credence to the story, and all 3 of them were pretty shaken by what had happened out there. So, Get out there and defend the prison. Spread out, be smart, and if the fence becomes damaged in the fight, be sure to call it in. There hadn't been a lot of questions, and no dissent amongst the assembled COs. The warden had learned 2 things from his time at Stagview. Inmates could be trusted to lie about almost anything, and correctional officers were, for the most part, a collection of functional sociopaths. You didn't even have to count on the normal ones to upset the apple cart either, because most of them could be taught that level of useful hostility with enough time on the job. None of them questioned why the protesters were dressed as scarecrows. None of them had any moral quandaries about shooting people who were trying to get in the prison. At the end of the day, many of them had only been waiting for an opportunity to practice violence on their fellow man, and it was a good thing they were on his side. As he stood in his tower watching the defenses play out, he couldn't help but wonder about the fate of the town. He was sure that his sister was organizing some kind of militia, but as long as the prison stood, he couldn't find it in him to care for anything else. A gleeful little part of him would have been happy to see Kashmir burn to the ground, and he would revel in the knowledge that his smug sister's little shelter had failed. All the same, he did count on the town to provide him with new meat for the Stagview grinder, in one form or another. As the rifles barked and the shotguns boomed, the scarecrows were put aside, and the warden supposed he had to hope for the best where his sister and her town were concerned. There was a soft whump from behind him, and the warden almost chuckled at the lack of stealth. He turned smoothly, pointing his finger like a gun at the creature that had suddenly leapt 80 feet into the air to land on the catwalk of his tower. It was hideous, some kind of pumpkin creature, and its body practically thrummed with life. If there was a human under that hooded sweatshirt, there wasn't much left. The mask it wore was less plastic and more skin these days, he suspected, and as he and the Pumpkinhead eyeballed each other, the warden felt no particular dread from the intruder. He had been more afraid of Jesse's ghost than this hollow creature. "So, would you like to tell me why your green man has seen fit to trespass on my property?" "You know why," the thing hissed, runners of seeds and pulp sliding down its chin. "We want the totem, and we want the laughing shadows. They aren't yours, neither one of them, and we want them." Trespassers coming to free trespassers. Sounds like the plot of a bad action movie. You should know you aren't getting either of them. I have the totem, and you can't free the shadows without it. Tell your green man that I'm tired of the attempts of Strange to enter my compound. My people are off limits. My prison is off limits. And unless he wants to join the shadows in confinement, he might want to back off. You don't control the Prince of Strange. He never got to finish the word. A lance of flame shot out as the warden splayed his fingers and disintegrated the left side of the creature. It cried out, grabbing the railing with its remaining hand and loosing a cry of agony to the moon. It leaked some strange combination of seeds and pulp, and as it hunkered, gasping, the warden bared his teeth at it. "Call me a mortal one more time, and I'll use your corpse for fertilizer in the prison garden. I am no more mortal than you are, you fucking golem, and you would do well to remember that. Go back to your master and tell him." But the creature chose then to launch himself at the warden amidst an expulsion of sound and fury. He was ash before he reached the halfway point, and the remains were taken by the wind as the warden stood posed in his victory. "Warden?" came a call over the radio. "Warden, is everything okay? We saw a bright flash. Are you 10-4? The warden reached for his walkie, wiping some of the char from his shoulder as the wind shifted a little. "Fine, just lit a cigarette. Keep your eyes on the fence." He glanced back at the spot where his enemy had been and found he was grinning. "No worry. I'll just tell him myself, then." "Nice try, Chuck," the Pumpkinhead said mockingly, "but that won't work on me.
I'm not of your world anymore, and your magic doesn't mean anything in strange."
He swung at me with the bat, and I felt the sigil slip from my hands as I was put back on my heels. He was quick, his feet coming down hard and fast as he pursued me. My staff came out, catching the next blow on its length, but he was a better fighter than I was, and I couldn't keep this up forever. Behind me, Grandpa was throwing up walls of air and force he used to defend himself, to keep the scarecrows back, but it was doing little but buying time. If I didn't find some way to end this soon, they would rush us and bury us under their numbers, and he knew it too.
"Keep your eyes on the fight, Chuck, otherwise something might slip through."
His bat slipped up the length of my stick, smacking my fingers and sending the air whooshing at me as it smashed into my stomach. I fell on my backside as the Pumpkinhead prepared to brain me with his shiny club.
"Kid!"
yelled Grandpa, he and the warriors still holding out against the tide of scarecrows as another wave of flaming arrows fell on them. In that light, I could see the glee on the terrible face of the Pumpkinhead.
"What you gonna do now, Chuck?"
he asked, swinging the bat straight for my head. I raised a hand, pleading for my magic, and when his swing was slowed by my pathetic facsimile of Grandpa's shield, I breathed a sigh of relief. The Pumpkinhead grinned too, clearly as surprised as I was.
Well, looks like you're just full of surprises, Chuck. Too bad your magic isn't strong enough to stop me."
He went right on grinning until I put a hole in his head with the .38 I had in my pocket.
"Then it's a good thing I had other tricks up my sleeve,"
I growled, watching a trickle of pulp and seed slide sickeningly out through the newly formed opening. He shook a little, his eyes trying to look at the hole as his legs lost purchase.
"Good one, Chuck,"
he half whispered, falling backwards bonelessly. His head smashed on the concrete as he hit the ground, and there was a sudden change in the assembled scarecrows. They turned as one to look back at the fog, and I thought for a moment that maybe the Pumpkinhead had been the one controlling them. As a shadow came clip-clopping from the fog, and my breath felt like it might freeze in my throat, I realized he was just the opening act. He was huge, 12 feet in the saddle, and the axe he carried over his shoulder looked big enough to fell a man in a single stroke. His green armor was the color of spring moss, and the eyes that burned from his helmet were the coals of a deep winter hearth fire. He seemed even bigger as I stared up from my backside, and as his voice boomed over me, I began to tremble.
"Winter has come for you, O Lady of Summer. Winter has come."
A collective chill ran through those of us assembled on the wall as the rider made his declaration. "What do we do?" I asked Randy. It seemed that the real enemy was before us, but as he sat his horse less than 100 feet away, I couldn't find my nerve. The air was full of ice. It was hard to find my breath. "We fight," came a surprisingly steady voice from behind us. We turned to see the lady, a thin, graceful sword in her hand, as she approached the gate. The queen was with her, the magnificent longsword on her shoulder, and her elf warriors had arrayed behind them. The other Brandylow, weapons at the ready, stood loosely around her, and though less impressive, they were no less fierce than the queen's 20. The gnomes had come too, the little potatoes forming something like a mob of soccer hooligans as they gathered in 7 or 8 tight clusters. The guardians had arrived, Rasfiel and his family, and they looked very large as they towered at the back of the group. "Milady, you should be—" Randy started, but she cut him off. "I've hidden in my grove while others fought for me for too long. Gabriella's right. I have no right to ask you all to die for me if I won't do the same for you. This is our home, and we will defend it from the depths of winter itself if we have to." Randy nodded. "Open the gates," he said, his eyes settling on me. I wanted to ask if he had lost his mind. We were still outnumbered 5-1, maybe more, and if we left our walls, we'd be dead in minutes. The scarecrows had proven less fearsome than we thought, but they were still so many of them. We probably hadn't even seen everything they had to throw at us, but I realized that none of that mattered as my hands grasped the smooth wood of the gate's crossbar. The lady had spoken, so we would fight. At the end of the day, it was a fact I had realized at the lily pond when Gabrielle had asked how the lady could sacrifice us. Our power was her power, our love for her unquestioning, and we would throw ourselves on the spears of her enemies if she asked. As the gate opened and we prepared to head into battle, I hoped it wouldn't be the end of my story. If it was, I hoped there would be someone to tell my ending around a fire the next time Brandylow gathered. I felt Grandpa grab me under the arm as he helped me to my feet. "Steady on, son. He's not the biggest boogin I've ever seen, and he won't be the last." The warriors had moved to stand behind him, protecting his back from the stationary scarecrows, and looking at them made me think these people might be from Glimmer's clan. They had the same white hair, the pointed ears, same as my favorite forest dweller, but I supposed that didn't make them related to her. If Grandpa knew, he wasn't elaborating. He stood shoulder to shoulder with me, ready to stand against the towering green knight. The armored man seemed to smirk down at him. "Old man, I can feel your power, and while impressive for one of your kind, you are nothing to me but this world's most impressive insect. Take your apprentice and fly away before I swat you along with these interlopers." In response, Grandpa laughed. "You boogins always think you're the biggest fish in the pond, but I haven't met a one of you that couldn't be surprised." The axe screeched as it ran across the pavement. "We shall see." Behind him, the shadows began to stretch, and I could see other things approaching. They were huge, their bodies oddly shaped, and the writhing mass that formed it set my teeth on edge. As they came up behind their master, my mind seemed unable to make sense of them. They were like corn plants, wound together into a throbbing torso of writhing snakes with a pair of bulging arms hanging from them. Their heads were a strange amalgamation of roots and corn plants, and once you saw the face, you couldn't unsee it. "The hell are those?" I breathed. "Corn abominations," Grandpa said. "I've heard of them, but I'd hoped I'd never see one." Grandpa was trying to be stoic about the whole thing, but I could see him shaking. This was more than even he was used to, and I wasn't sure this was something we could come out of. This was no bone collector, no spirit to be chased out of a house, and we were surrounded out here. "Grandpa," I asked, 38 in one hand, as my other hand clenched as if the staff I'd had wasn't somewhere in that sea of scarecrows. "Have faith, son. I know it looks bad, but this isn't our time yet. Focus your power, form your shield in your mind, and when the time comes, we'll be ready." As the gates slid open behind us, I closed my eyes and felt my power build. As the forces of the garden screamed out their defiance, I felt the electricity at the tip of my fingers. I wanted my staff. I wanted the focus it would bring me when the time came. But beggars couldn't always be choosers. As the battle joined and we prepared to hold out against this armored juggernaut, I felt something else too. It was a building, like a pressure from a storm as it thunders across the sky. The horse screamed as it reared up, the axe squealing as he raised it above his head. I was shaking, hoping I had enough focus to stop that two-handed swing, from killing me and Gramps. Despite the present danger of that killing blade, the pressure continued to build around us, as if a great storm was preparing to open up. "What in the hell do you think you're doing in my town?" The voice roared across the parking lot like a shockwave, and the Green Knight froze in his swing. He turned his armored head, the hinges squealing as they grated against his armor, and I noticed someone new had arrived, someone stranger than the Knight and his entourage. She was dressed in pajamas with little hearts on them, something from Walmart or Dollar General, and that was the most normal thing about her. A pair of horns jutted through a perfectly normal tousle of chestnut hair, her leather wings having turned her terry cloth robe into a tattered cape. She was a being at odds with herself, her monstrous nature made almost mundane by the image of it bursting from a perfectly normal woman. That was the only reason I recognized her at all. It was hard not to when we had passed one of her billboards on the way here. She'd been carrying a smaller, dark-haired woman, and as she let her down, I could feel that she also wasn't quite what she seemed. "How dare you bring your feud into my town? I could have ignored your trespass if you had limited your presence to the gardens, but your minions have been allowed to run free on the streets of Kashmir." The armored figure stared at her from the depths of his helmet, finally uttering an unimpressed, "And Kashmir is my territory. I suggest you leave unless you want trouble," she said, the long talons sprouting from her fingers, fidgeting in anticipation. He brought the axe across the pommel of his saddle, looking at the impudent creature, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "I do not take orders from Hellspawn. You have no power over me, no more than you have over any entity of Strange. This is a private matter. Leave, or see yourself brought into it." The creature smirked. "So be it then." I was flipping through the cameras on the first floor of the medical center when I saw something very odd. As I flipped through the cameras on the first floor of the medical center, I had to blink a few times before I could believe the weirdness I was seeing. You won't understand exactly how odd a statement that is, but given where I was sitting, it was odd even for the setting. Seeing a bunch of spooks chase a group of scarecrows through the halls of the hospital was probably the strangest thing I had ever seen in all my time here. I saw a group come running out of the OR corridor as shaky-leg Mary ambled after them on her twisted legs. She had caught a few of them, leaving them scattered in the hallway, and as she ran on all fours to get a few others, I almost laughed. The door to the boiler room burst open as the boiler man came stomping after others, Jason Voorhees style, as he chased them in his slow, methodic way. There were some of those strange, eyeless dogs that the doctor and the medical records guy had described, and the ghost girl from the 5th floor balcony and some of her ethereal friends came after another group. There were even some faces I didn't know. If these were the entities that the scarecrows had been hunting for, they clearly did not appreciate their intrusion and were ready for them to leave. Haggard old specters in gowns and bloody rags menaced them. Twisted creatures that looked like nothing human drug them into dark corners, and as it all played out, the lights of the hospital flickered, sending a nervous wave through the survivors. Then the power went out, leaving us in darkness for about 30 seconds, before suddenly coming back on. When I got the cameras up again, the halls of the first floor were completely empty. Not a trace of scarecrows, or straw, or the ghostly residents of the hospital to be had anywhere. It appeared the siege was over. It appeared that no matter how much the hospital seemed to enjoy tormenting us, that it would not suffer interlopers. "They're gone," I said, my voice sounding very loud in the quiet. "What?" Carl asked, coming over to the camera as he panned back through. Did they all leave?" "I mean, it appears so," I said, flipping through quickly so as to see all the cameras before answering. I wanted to be sure before I said anything, but they do appear to have gone." Carl nodded, rounding up 3 or 4 members of the security crew, as well as a few volunteers to help sweep the first floor. "Keep an eye on the cameras and let me know if anything changes," he said, heading into the stairwell as the 12 of them went to search. I told him I would, but I couldn't help but laugh at how in the end the old hospital had protected us from the invasion. Like a mother hen protecting its chicks, I thought. Like a vampire protecting its potential food source, I also thought. "Sir," chirped the radio, and the warden grabbed it up as he lowered his binoculars. "Go ahead, Officer Carraway," he said, already guessing what she had to report. "Sir, they're retreating." "Excellent," he said, a sigh of relief slipping out. "Maintain your position in case they come back, but no one is to shoot after them. If they're leaving, let them go." 10-4, she said, and the radio went quiet. The warden of Stragview closed his eyes, relishing the victory over whatever that had been. An invasion, an incursion, an attempted robbery. Whatever it had been, they had won. They found less than a dozen on the compound, and he had dealt with most of them himself. His post officer was still unaccounted for, and one of the others had needed to be taken to the infirmary after a few of the scarecrows had fallen off the fence and injured him. All in all, one missing and one injured was a small price to pay for the continued safety of the compound. He wondered where the scarecrows had gone, but not with much interest. Like his sister, he had defended his territory and was now prepared to go back into his tower to relax. Whatever might be happening in town was none of his business. Tonight, Stragview had defended itself successfully from outsiders entering the compound, and he would take that win. There was a decanter of aged scotch and a half-smoked cigar waiting for him on his desk, and he could think of few better ways to celebrate his victory.
"We came for the totem and the laughing shadows. They ain't yours, neither of 'em, and we want 'em."
The words of the Pumpkin Man echoed in his head, and the warden sighed as he stood in the doorway of his tower. Damn it. He still had a message to send, and until he did, that scotch would taste like sludge. "Control," he said into the radio. "I am returning to my office. Get Sergeant Hefsley on the phone and tell him that he's been promoted to captain of D-Card. He can start tonight. Get maintenance down here ASAP and let Captain Kelly out, and send him to my office to wait. If he leaves, that's okay too. I'll reach him later. Till then, I am not to be disturbed." They said something back, but he dropped the radio after finishing. He rose into the air on leathery wings and was away before he heard any of it. In the parking lot of the Botanical Garden, a fierce battle was underway, and the Brandylow would tell tales of it for years to come. Those who escaped it, of course. The Pale Lady and her forces cut into the scarecrows, but their fugue wasn't to last. Randy and his deputies led the ranks of the lady against them, cutting through them with fiery resolve. The Grove Guardians swept them aside easily, parting the sackcloth legion, and the gnomes chewed many of them into threadbare piles. The Moon Elves fought with them too, sending hay and cloth fluttering to the ground. More of the pumpkin heads came out of the fog, helping direct the scarecrows and put them in formations. They had bats, long silver things that they swung with ease, and when the corn abominations joined the fight, the Grove Guardians were forced to break away and answer them. They fought to reach the group that stood against the Green Man, They were sorely pressed, but holding their own regardless. The old man and his apprentice kept their unlikely allies from being cut to ribbons, and as the apprentice fired his weapon and the old man kept the green man on his toes, the guardian of Kashmir and her unlikely lover did battle with the vengeful spirit of Strange. Ah, but the green man was resourceful, and he would not be so easily put aside. "I don't," I panted out, stumbling back as the green behemoth slashed his axe at us again. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Gramps." He started to say something, but spun and brought a wall of air between that axe and the creature I still suspected was Dr. Pamela Winters. I couldn't imagine it being anyone else. Her face was on commercials, billboards, and bus stations for 3 counties in any direction, and the resemblance was too uncanny to be anything else. Yet, here she was, moving like an anime character as she hit this ridiculous Ren Fair reject again and again. She would crash into him, her wings pushing her forward at an alarming speed before moving away so the dark-haired woman could slam into his other side. Her companion's composure slipped more and more with each attack, and she was beginning to resemble some low-budget movie monster. It was all so weird, and if my hand and ass hadn't still been stinging from the fight with the Pumpkinhead, I'd have thought I was having some elaborate dream. "Do what you can, kid," he shouted, shoving the knight back before the axe could slice through the possible doctor. "If these 2 go down, we may be in a real pickle." His horse reared up suddenly on my left, iron-shod hooves boxing the air, and I bellowed in rage as I pushed out enough raw energy to shove it over as the killing blows rained down on me. I was almost out of gas, and I knew it. Using my talent with any amount of confidence was still new to me, and the power I was throwing around was raw and untrained. I was like a sieve straining noodles, pushing out way more than I needed to with every successful task. Something rose up on my left again, and I put a bullet in it, almost forgetting the gun was in my hand. The scarecrow went down in a flurry of chaff, but when I tried to blast the one behind it, the cylinder fell on an empty chamber. I reached into my pocket, dumping the spent shells and popping in fresh, and that's when I saw it. It had been kicked a little further than I had expected, but I could see the black lacquered length of my staff as it lay on the concrete a few feet away. I slid the gun back into my pocket after snapping it shut and lunged for the stick before it could get any further. When my hands settled on the comfortable wooden grip, however, something loomed up to my right, and I turned to find another Pumpkinhead grinning down at me. "End of the line, runt," he laughed, raising the bat for a strike. I lifted the stick to catch it, but when something sparked off the bat and sent it spilling out of his hands, we both looked over to see a furry goat man in a security uniform, the barrel of his shotgun still smoking. "Remember me?" he said, working the slide as he kept the nose trained on the Pumpkinhead. The creature grinned, its bravado dampened not at all. "Can't say as I do. You goats all look the same to me." The smile evaporated right along with its head as the shotgun reduced him to pulp from the neck up. "Pity, and was hoping you were the one I was looking for." He reached down to offer me a hand, and as I came upright, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen came striding towards the knight. "Your stamina is admirable, apprentice, but take heart." When she smiled at me, I felt my tired and achy muscles loosen, and it was like localized Bengay had been spread across every inch of my hurting body. Being near her was like laying on a beach at the height of summer, and I felt a renewed strength wash over me. She was the antithesis of the other, and I could see why so many would fight for her. I have been fighting winter since I arrived in this strange world, and I don't intend to stop now. Winter gritted her teeth not sure how she was going to get rid of this annoying armored pain in the ass. Maggie had several half-healed wounds from close calls with the Green Man, and Winter hadn't come away unscathed. If it hadn't been for the old man and his apprentice, she wasn't sure how they would have stood a chance against him. But so far, they had managed to avoid being ripped asunder by that huge axe of his. Winter wasn't too worried about herself. Her form could be fixed, and the worst this thing could do is send her back to the pits that had spawned her. Maggie, on the other hand, was not so lucky. She was nimble, but Winter could see the creature heaving for breath as a long gash across her front knit back together with slow deliciousness. The delicate voice of Winter counseled to let the miserable wretch smash herself against the otherworldly being until she broke. But Pamela reminded her that this was why they had left her father's hall in the first place. They were not like their kin, and the dark humanity within them needed nurturing if it was to grow. She loved Marguerite, and the thought of her being destroyed made Pamela want to weep. She put herself between the imposing warrior and her love, but when he hit another one of those shields the old man and his apprentice cast, she breathed a sigh of relief. "Maggie, get out of here. There's no reason you have to." "Don't you dare," Maggie hissed, staggering back to her feet. "Don't you think for a moment that I would abandon you to this creature. I will stand with you until I am no more, and that's all there is to it." Pamela wanted to argue with her, but Winter understood. "So be it. Come on, then. We need to save the..." But Maggie gasped as something slammed a gnarled fist into her, hard enough to snap her collarbone like a twig. Winter roared in anger, turning to call flames in the direction of the root creature that had caught them off guard. It was massive, larger than its master by a substantial amount, but she had seen bigger. The pits were full of brutes like this one, but as the flames took root inside it, he roared and fell into a mass of smoldering mulch. She went to Maggie, glancing around to make sure there weren't any other horrors skulking, and found her hissing as her body tried to put itself back together. Pamela wasn't sure what to do. She couldn't leave Maggie, but if she left, then this creature would grow bolder with her exit. She glanced back at the knight and saw that he had stopped coming towards her, turning instead as he made his way towards the Magi. Their group of moon elves was holding off the scarecrows, their hands full with the endless waves of sack men, and Winter realized that she couldn't help him. As the scarecrows began to come out of the fog towards them, their numbers swelling yet again, Winter dashed her hand at them and reveled as the fire kissed their dry bodies. The Magi would have to do for himself, and she hoped he would be okay. The old man had once called her a succubus, had actually stood outside her clinic and told people how she was trying to steal their life force under the guise of help. She smirked. She supposed he had his proof now, though he may have been able to do more than just rattle his saber, it would seem. It seemed there were more than a few secrets in town worth knowing. I goggled at the strange woman, not really understanding what or who she was, but when a furry hand came up to put my jaws back together, I looked down to see one of the security-clad creatures wink at me. I know she's a lot to take in, but don't get caught staring. She won't like that. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, watching a few others come clopping up as her ragged band came to help the lady. "What?" I asked, trying not to insult him, but finally landing on the one thing I could find to ask. "What are you?" The creature laughed, but before he could answer, I heard Grandpa cough as he tried to throw up another shield. The Green Man was looming up, the axe sending sparks out as it impacted with his defenses. Grandpa was backpedaling, but he never lost his feet. It was as if he intended to die with dignity, if it was his time. My shot rang off the helmet of the Green Warrior before I could think better of it, and when he turned to look at me, he saw her. "You," he gasped, turning away from Grandpa as the two stared at each other. We cut around them, letting them have their standoff, and when I put an arm around Grandpa, he sagged against me.
"Thanks, kid. I was almost Hey, you're a Brandy-Low, aren't you?"
He coughed as he finished, and it was a cough I was beginning to think would put him back on breathing treatments when, or if, we got back home. The creature nodded. "I am, one of many. The lady's here now, so if you all want to rest, feel free to—"
"Balls to that,"
Grandpa husked, turning back to watch the lady stride delicately towards the night.
"She may yet need our help."
The Brandy-Low shrugged. "Who knows? You might be right." "Finally," the Green Man rasped, his voice escaping that great helmet like a cloud of frost. "You have come to meet your better." "I've come to meet you in the field as I have 1,000 times before," she retorted.
"It isn't summer now, my lady. Not fall or spring either. This is the heart of winter, and you cannot win."
She took up her rapier, that long, delicate blade that she had so often used to hold this one at bay, and smiled. "I suppose we'll see about that." The axe rose, his arms lifting it easily, and as it swung over her like a guillotine, the lady prepared to live or die. She put that first stroke aside with a motion of fluid grace and smiled as the head buried itself into the parking lot. "You'll not have me so easy, O Winter Lord. I am not some village maiden or willing sacrifice. You will have to do better than that if you mean to end our feud." And so they fought. Time began to stand still as their weapons flashed, their bodies spinning like dancers in a well-loved routine. The two had done this so many times before, their armies within range ravaging the landscape, leaving whole continents locked in mortal combat between the two rivals. That was why they had been expelled, after all. They'd been sent elsewhere for the good of the world, and now this place was their battlefield. The thought that this world would be the final confrontation was as unthinkable to her as the idea that she might not be here to bring in the next season's flowers. She never sought him, but was always pursued. She loved the world, loved it as much as he seemed to despise it, and it was always he who sought to stop the growing season. Their blades flashed, their weapons clashed, and the world around them seemed to leave them encapsulated. To her chagrin, she was the first one to miss a step, and she paid for it dearly. The axe arced out, slicing her calf and sending her stumbling. She blocked the next blow, and the one after that, but when he shoved her with the haft of his massive axe, she fell onto the rough stone lot where so many of her victims left their cars forever. She spun, meaning to catch the blow, but she saw it hovering above her as her adversary tried in vain to push it down and end her life. It seemed the old wizard and his apprentice had some juice left after all. He growled, lifting his weapon to strike again, when something hit him in the side and sent him stumbling. A horned woman was bellowing as she attacked, and the lady took advantage of the distraction to harass her enemy further. The scarecrows had begun to advance again, but the moon elves were keeping them at bay, as well as the Brandy-Low and the towering wooden guardians. The gnomes moved among the straw men, mowing through them like the tools her people used to keep the grass from overtaking the park. Somehow, she was winning out against her enemy's forces, even at the height of his power. He was unable to get his feet under him, and as they pushed him back, the Green Man was forced to swing ineffectively at his attackers to keep them at bay. She had felt certain that they might turn this around, but as he caught the horned woman by the leg, throwing her like a rag doll, she imposed herself between he and the wizards as he tried to make a dash for them.
"Coward," he growled, breathing heavily as he surveyed them. "This is our conflict, always has been, and you draw in outsiders." "She never did," the old wizard spat, and the Green Knight turned his helmeted head towards him as he spoke. You brought your old fight into a place I have sworn to protect, and I won't just stand idly by while you move freely." "Nor will I," said the demon woman, the creature hunched beside her looking battered but ready for more. "Nor I," said a new voice, as he came striding from the fog. The man wore an immaculate pinstriped suit, his golden glasses glittering in the lights of the parking lot as his own nature made itself known. The woman was not the only demon in town, it would seem, and as the lady's new allies hemmed the green man in, he seemed to rethink his bravado. "Is this truly the game you wish to play, O Lady of the Growing Season? The rules have always been the two of us, our armies, our wills. But if you wish to change the rules, then I too can adapt." She started to tell him that they hadn't come to any call she had sent up, but the demon woman answered for her. "You have come to our town and made your rivalry our business. Next time you return, remember that Kashmir has things ready to defend those who reside here, this lady among them." The green man glanced around, not sure what to make of all that, and when the fog rolled in suddenly, she feared no retaliation from this one. "Next time," came his whispered response. "I won't play quite so fair. Until then." And when the fog cleared, it was all gone. The scarecrows, the corn creatures, the skeletal horse, and its rider were all gone. A cheer went up from the assembled fighters, and the lady breathed a sigh of relief. They had won, somehow. "Better late than never, brother," Winter said, thinking this may have been the only time in their lives when she was happy to see him. "I assumed you had it under control. Besides, I had trouble on the home front I had to take care of first." She smirked, sure he was being cagey, but appreciating his presence if not his strength. "Sister, who is this you have here? I haven't seen one of her kind in quite some time." McGhee stiffened a little, her body clearly still trying to put itself to rights, and offered a shaky hand to the warden of Stragview. "I am Marguerite," she said, the words painful. "Pamela's my partner," Winter said, surprising Maggie, who had clearly not meant to say quite that much. The warden chuckled a little, and Winter began to bristle at him before he asked, "Pamela? It's my name in town, as you know. We all can't go by a title." The warden shrugged. "True, but in my line of work, we don't really do names. Titles are safer." The sound of a thumping stick brought all three looking up as the two wizards and the beautiful stranger came walking towards them. "Do we go?" asked the warden. "I don't really want trouble if I can help it." "No," Winter said suddenly. "Stay and meet the neighbors. Who knows, you might need to borrow some sugar sometime." The lady bowed to them, the two humans bowing a little more stiffly before she introduced herself as the Pale Lady. "Ah," the warden said, "another cast-off from Strange. I thought I felt something a little different on the outskirts of town." Winter gave him a look before he could give away too much, and to her surprise, he quieted. "My brother and I have taken this place as our territory. We are also from..." She thought about the best way to explain it and landed on "out of town." The old man snorted. "Way out of town, I'd say. You told the police I was a crazy old man when I said you were a succubus." "Well," Winter said, "it wasn't a lie. Calling me a succubus was extremely insulting. My people are far higher in the caste system than that." "You're lucky it was her and not me," the warden put in. "I would have been much less forgiving over such slights." "Well," the lady said, "wherever you're from and however you came to be here, I am eternally grateful that you came to my aid. Thank you. We all thank you," she said, indicating the furry goat creatures who stood near her. "It was our pleasure," said the old man, dipping his head to her. "Speak for yourself," said the younger of the two. "I was still sleeping off Christmas dinner." They both laughed, and the lady invited all of them into the park for a celebration. "I have to return to my prison," said the warden, "but I'm sure we'll be in touch. It's always nice to have powerful friends, and the work release is always bothering me about new contracts." The old man and his apprentice agreed to come inside, and Winter and Maggie said they would as well. What followed was a party to rival any the area had seen in quite some time. The wine flowed, the festivities became raucous, and all involved ate and drank till their hearts were satisfied. When the old man and his apprentice stumbled home the next day, it was with the assurances that the two of them would be there if the park was ever in trouble again. "Though maybe not for a couple of days," Grandpa said with a hearty laugh as his grandson drove him home. Dr. Winter and Marguerite made their goodbyes as well, telling the lady that she had only to ask and they would arrive. Neighbors have to look out for each other, and who knows what else might come creeping up in Appalachia. At Kashmir Hospital, a similar party had been taking place since the night the lockdown ended, and when the day shift got there the next day, Carl had some explaining to do. All involved were admonished for a job well done, but there would definitely be some new protocols in place, just in case something like this ever happened again. No footage remains of the ghosts in their defense of Kashmir Medical, but poor David was in for a scare the next day. He had gone to the basement to check on the boilers and found 3 or 4 of the scarecrows lying around down there. They were less lively than the ones he had seen the night before. They had somehow avoided being chased away by the ghosts, and avoided being taken when the Green Man left. If anyone else had thought about it, they might have wondered how that could happen. As it was, David burned them out behind the hospital, and that was ultimately the end of the excitement in Kashmir. The town returned to something like normal, and most of the townspeople were never even sure what had happened. For those who were, however, it was a night they would never forget.